Thank you all so much for coming. We're delighted to have you here for our summer page views. I am Rebecca Prime. I'm the outgoing editor of Film Quarterly. And going forward, you're going to be hearing from J.M. Tyree, who took over the reins at Film Quarterly just at the beginning of this month. So I'm really very grateful to have this one final opportunity to be with you for what we like to think of as our Film Quarterly book series that highlights what we think are some of the most exciting new titles in film and media studies publications. And delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Bruno Guaraná, who has been expertly helming the series since its inception a few years ago. Bruno is a master lecturer in film studies at Boston University and edits our Page Views Live feature for us that appears in every issue and includes not only an introduction to a new publication, but always a very interesting conversation with the author. And then you can find an excerpt, usually the introduction to the book that we put online, available online. So I will give the hard work of introducing the book to Bruno. But before we do that, I just want to mention a few housekeeping details. We will be taking questions from the audience. We love questions from the audience, but please put them in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. And we will be opening up the conversation to questions at about the 12:40, 12:45 mark. And then I also would like to mention that University of Minnesota has given us a discount code that is going to be good through the end of the summer, so through September 1. And that will, actually, I don't know the percentage off. Marina, do you know how much off the discount code provides?
I believe it's 40%.
Oh, okay. So a very, very good deal. And so you can go ahead and get a head start on your summer reading, or as you're planning your classes. There's the book. It looks beautiful. We just learned that Marina actually has not even had the opportunity to hold the book in her hands because she's traveling this summer. So she has that to look forward to when she gets back to New York. So we will be putting that discount code in the chat. So look out for that. And I will hand it over to you now, Bruno, to give us an introduction to Marina's book.
Thanks, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see so many familiar names here in this webinar. Joining me, Rebecca and Marina, in this talk. I'll hold up again. This is Marina's book, Interactive Cinema, The Ambiguous Ethics of Media Participation. And I'll say a few words about it before I turn over to Marina in our conversation. And I do invite you guys to participate as you wish by adding your questions to the Q&A section. In my assessment of the book, it really offers an invaluable contribution to digital media studies by theorizing and historicizing interactivity in cinema, broadly defined by her, while assessing the ambiguous ethics behind such practices. Rather than a recent phenomenon, interactivity here is understood in a continuum with analog cinema. Also guiding Marina's work and narrative in the book is an impulse to disrupt binary notions of interactivity in digital media more broadly as either democratic or tyrannical. We'll certainly talk a little bit about that. While favoring interactive media for their potential to indeed train and change viewers, as well as challenge the passivity often attributed to media consumption, Marina highlights how they can also be manipulative, controlling, and unethical. As with any technology, interactive cinema can also easily reproduce dominant ideologies and reinforce structural inequalities. And to account for this, the book offers a nuanced approach to digital media that considers not just technology, but also the text in its multiple contexts, like that of the production and the much less predictable context of consumption. Marina's book shows that only an approach centered on the ethics and politics of representation in interactive texts can assess how interactivity may disrupt structures of domination, often reproduced in the cinematic experience. Interactivity as a concept also offers an opportunity for us to reconsider traditional models of spectatorship developed in film theory that rely on the binary classification of spectators, either passive or active. carefully pointing key theories in texts that already implied a notion of interactivity in cinema. Marina opts for taking the spectator as an entity always vacillating between passivity and agency, so neither one or the other, but always both. Expanding the notion of interactivity to account for the different ways viewers engage with the text, Marina suggests that watching is already an interactive procedure. And so in this sense, in her words, cinema has always been interactive. But of course, the degree of interactivity varies greatly with the text, its platform or medium, and its conditions of reception or consumption. While highlighting her embodied experience when in contact with these texts, she analyzes through the book, Marina considers how interactive cinema may engage viewers' different senses, which disrupts the privileged position of vision in film studies, how it relies on viewers' interaction with one another, respond algorithmically to limited and conditional interactions, and even offer what she terms a moral training ground for critical users. While doing so, Marina also offers fascinating glimpses on the backstage, right, discussing the challenges with working with digital and interactive media as ephemeral objects of study. I'll be very interested to discuss that a little bit as well. The book has an impressive scope that covers a variety of media formats and texts from across the world, and indeed expands notions of cinema and interactivity. To treat interactive media as cinematic also means to reject the notion that we currently live in a post-cinematic age, and to take interactivity as yet another frontier in the history and study of media. This is no doubt a powerful and important book in media studies, not only because of the great allure interactive media holds in our times, but also because it bears implications of medium specificity and the power and future of cinema. So once again, I'd like to thank Marina for sharing her valuable work and joining us for yet another conversation about her book. I'll highlight that we have an introduction to the book available on our website at Film Quarterly, alongside the my introduction and interview as it was published in the latest issue of Film Quarterly. So Marina, thanks for being here with us today, and congratulations on the book that you haven't yet seen in print form. I'll let you say a few words, but I also wanted you to start by telling us a little bit about how you first got interested in the idea of interactive cinema, or where the project first started.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thank you, Bruno, and thanks to Rebecca and Film Quarterly for organizing this, and also for publishing the first review that, as I mentioned to you before, it raised the bar very high in terms of reviews for the book. And yes, so how the project began, I would say, and I did the math, so now it's been 20 years since I started my graduate studies, and I was always fascinated with practices that were outside of the box. It's originally started with an interest in experimental cinema, which can seem very daunting to a new, film studies student, but I really wanted to learn more about the history of expanded cinema and what that could mean. And then also very interested in either non-theorized or understudied forms of cinema as they intersect with other media arts practices, early digital and electronic experiments, and so on. So a particular challenge that I found very productive was to study specific forms of spectatorship that cannot be neatly theorized. So looking at the issues with the macro of canons, and then also looking very specifically at micro, which means regional material particularities and so on. And I remember one of the first anthologies that was very eye-opening to me, again, as a new graduate student, was the anthology Future Cinema, the cinematic imaginary after film, edited by Jeffrey Shaw and Peter Weibel, who, in my opinion, are legendary in their own right. And that particular anthology really approached cinema as this interconnected media landscape, and it really incorporated the work of theorist practitioners. So many artists that I look to, that I feature in the book, actually published their own essays. Sometimes they felt like manifestos on what was then the new era of interactive art, and so on. So that, alongside the New Media Reader anthology, were very productive in terms of branching out of more canonical film and media theory, which I think is a necessary foundation. I don't want to dismantle everything, right? But I could sense that there was something more, and that some fields needed to be in conversation with one another more. And now with the popularizing of digital humanities methodologies, of the computational humanities, I think it's even more necessary to bridge specific fields, to create conversations between artists and practitioners and industry professionals, and so on. So initially it was a scavenger hunt, trying to find what could be accessible, what I could directly watch, and I'm sure we'll get into those issues of access later on. And the research also was very rhizomatic. It still was very difficult to focus on a cohesive linear book form. So it started as a blog. Yes, and now we have the book and its extensions.
Yeah, so because you mentioned the blog, there is an extension of the book online. Can you tell us a little bit about that so we can also
Yes.
direct
So I
people
don't know
there?
if we have the link in the chat. Maybe I'll put it again. So the web extension is actually an extension of the original blog that I used when I was writing my dissertation, because I just couldn't keep track of the topic. Just kept sprawling, and I thought the form of the blog that is multilinear, is non-hierarchical, is actually the native form of my thought process as well. So I started just putting everything on a blog as a research blog. And at the time, multimedia forms of scholarship were not as legitimized in terms of the dissertation. Thankfully, now we don't have to advocate that much for them. And then recently, so last summer in particular, with the assistance of my former student, so young Liz Yoon, we refurbished InterArchive, the original blog, and we turned it into a newly updated website that features contributions from the artists themselves. It highlights media archaeology projects that my students and I do with our CD and DVD-ROM collection. It has some input from institutions. Even this summer, I've made new connections with institutions for more donations, but it basically started as a no-budget crowdsourced effort. And I do have to say that this website will ironically become ephemeral in the fall, because NYU hosting no longer supports this website. So I will be once again migrating, and I think most likely I will migrate to a free platform. Might be more sustainable, I guess, ironically. But yes, for now we have this particular resource. And then if you go to the book tab, you can actually navigate the different contents of the website based chapter by chapter. Of course, there are a lot of extras, and then you can access colored and more high definition versions of the images in the book. Don't expect high quality, because some are from emulators, others are from very old cell phone photos, and so on. But we did our best with the images that we have.
So I wanted to go back a little bit to you were talking about your sort of first interaction with the concept of interactive cinema through these anthologies. Do I understand it correctly that sort of the scholarly contact came before an actual experience as a viewer of interactive cinema, or do you remember an experience that was really groundbreaking for you that sparked that interest?
Yes, I would say one of the most groundbreaking was watching the revived, kind of digitally restored version of Kino Automat, which is one of the most generative case studies in the book. And I wrote an article on Kino Automat now over 10 years ago. And it was very interesting to revisit that, to expand it, to incorporate more recent theory and so on. And I would say another reason besides its innovative, forward-thinking approach to expanded cinema, Kino Automat is very useful in terms of providing a more adaptable and hybrid methodology for studying ephemeral media and for studying cinema as an inconsistent object, right? So Kino Automat started as a site-specific participatory screening at Expo 67 in Montreal. Then it migrated for a while to specific screenings within then communist Czechoslovakia. Then it was banned for a few decades. Then it became revived again on Czech television with a dual channel kind of interactive version that is fascinating, but has not survived outside of Czech broadcasting. And then it did the festival rounds, especially in Europe. And then I got to it through the DVD. So I worked my way backwards in a way in this excavation process. And of course, other very notable studies include Chris Hales's detailing of the process of restoring and remediating the original Kino Automat. Erkki Huhtamo has mentioned it very early on in his work on media archaeology and interactive art. So I had a pretty strong foundation to begin with, but I felt that films like that should be more integrated into the history of cinema itself, not just seen as gimmicky, marginalized. We cannot theorize neatly, therefore we forget about it, and so on. Yes.
So I find that to be a very, as I said, iterative case study, because you get the DVD, right? But you have to trace back the technology and the ways that the film was originally distributed. So tell us a little bit about what format was Kino Automat on, and what kind of interactivity did it generate for viewers? I guess in its first iteration, right?
In its first iteration in Expo 67 in Montreal, which, as I revisited my original work on Kino Automat, the expo itself became even more nuanced, because now within the context of indigenous identities and pluralism, global expos have become more problematic in terms of national representation and so on, which was one of my first areas when I got into film and cultural studies, right? But I didn't want that chapter to go all over the place, but there's a lot more to say about Expo 67. Make sure you read the footnotes, because those could be additional chapters. But yes, so in the original format, it was a dual projector. So depending on the majority vote, the projectionist would uncover one of the two projectors and play the desired version. And pretty high tech for its time, the audience seats were connected to voting consoles. So audiences would vote in color codes of green and red, yes or no, to simplify. And then if you see some archival pictures, you can see all the little red and green votes being tallied across the screen. So they would go around and envelope the screen, which I really love, because sometimes participation, even in the cognitive sense, is so private during the theatrical cinematic experience. And the Kino Automat voting system actually visualized those patterns. Chinchera, the director, also unexpectedly realized that it's a great study in audience dynamics, in kind of how audiences vote that doesn't necessarily reflect on their, let's say, personal desire, but on how others will perceive how they vote. So there are some interesting anecdotes of people censoring their decisions when a group of nuns were in the audience. So they went for the more conservative version of Kino Automat, and so on. And then the last version is the DVD. So the DVD has been contextualized for more modern audiences, and there was a live video DJ in the original version, who would prompt the audience to reflect more deeply on choice, right? On the fact that they get to choose, or do they, right? On identification, on spectatorship. So it was supposed to be a more critical experience. And then in the DVD version, we have a newer version of this kind of usher of the experience that also gives historical information. And in the rather now glitchy DVD, you get to choose on your screen between the red or the green option. So sticking to the original kind of dual trajectory.
Right. And so one thing that I wanted to discuss as well is, this is an example of a collective viewing experience, right? So much more cinematic, if we think of cinematic as being theatrical, whereas, as you said before, interaction with media tends to be more private and invisible, as well as just individually experienced. Yet you title the book as interactive cinema, and I'm fascinated by this idea of the cinematic in these interactive media that tend to take place often outside of the movie theater, right? In personal computers, in art galleries, and so forth. So can you explain a little bit about the gesture of maintaining cinema as the umbrella in which these media should be viewed?
Yes. And of course, cinema could mean so many different things, right? But I felt it important to include cinema in the title, particularly since this book is part of the University of Minnesota Press's electronic mediation series, which was actually one of my first introductions to digital media theory when it was still an emerging field. And I felt that it's important to retain that term. It's also a nod to obviously my affiliation with the Cinema Studies department. And also I felt it important to involve film studies, which sometimes it's seen as a field that is, I don't want to say outdated, but traditional, I don't know. Again, I'm not going to use specific terms, but that it's outside of current debates in the digital humanities, for instance, in computational studies and so on. So I felt it was important to converge interactivity and cinema to show what film studies has to offer to all these timely debates, and also to show that there's actually a long-standing history and various traditions. And the computational ethos was there before the technology was there, right? So yes, so I kept it knowing that it's a very slippery term. And what I noticed also from doing now book launch events and so on, as you read the book, the definition of interactivity becomes more and more focused, I would say, in a plural sense, right? We have somatic interactivity, we have ecological forms of interactivity, phenomenological, multisensory, of course, technical, and so on. So it becomes more precise in its diversified notion, if that makes sense, whereas cinema becomes more and more elusive in order to expose the fact that cinema has always been a figment, right? Outside of its institutional and maybe certain material tenets that are becoming more and more questionable and multiplied, right? It was never as cohesive as the field wants it to be, I guess. But I really enjoy that. I think both interactivity and cinema are very generative concepts. So my goal was not to provide a comprehensive definition, but rather to carve different paths of looking at both cinema and interactivity, also the ethical and the socio-political and the culturally specific and historically specific dimensions are important. And when I started this kind of project, I also felt more of this kind of the border aspects, the cultural studies, they need to be more integrated into computational studies, interface, infrastructure. So it had the dual purpose of giving something to other fields and then also expanding my own immediate field.
Yeah, you call it a slippery term, right? But to me, it's a very provocative phrasing as well, right? That you then unpack throughout the book with going back to earlier theorists, right? And their idea of impurity, Bazin's idea of impure cinema, and the idea of computational logic preceding the digital imagery. So it's a lovely way to provoke really the discipline into rethinking how it defines itself and how it defines its object. And so speaking of objects, actually, I have a question that might be quite challenging, but you've been through it, which is come up with and sort of commit to the specific corpus that ended up in the book.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I have to say that a lot has been taken out. Okay.
And it's on the
Otherwise,
website, right?
it's some of it I'm still working on adding. There's a lot more to add, but I have to do the migration first now. It was more of a process of what to include, okay? So, and I issued a disclaimer early on in the introduction that it's not supposed to be comprehensive. It's not even supposed to be global in any, sense of the word. Part of the criteria had to do with what was accessible to me as a media historian, also as somebody who is now fortunate to have access to our moving image archiving and preservation program, where we have some of the original equipment, where I have people helping me in our study center remediate, create emulators, and so on. So part of the scope was by default determined by what was accessible, what was retrievable. And I also am a collector of all these things that are now ephemera, right? So I already had a collection and expanded the cinema studies, particularly in the interactive, the CD-ROM, DVD-ROM collection. Then the other criterion was, which of these different media do I have something original to say? I didn't want to recycle, I wanted my interventions to be meaningful, which also meant I had to do away with certain media that I particularly love, but they were just supporting an argument that had already been made, as my editors pointed out. So I just let them go eventually, right? And the book, I still consider it a pretty diverse catalog, right? There are mentions to things I wish I could have gone into more detail, but there was no space. So prioritizing was one of the biggest challenges. And then one thing that helped was the themes, right? So every chapter offers a different definition of both interactivity and cinema, right? So I knew for sure, actually the introduction was its own chapter. So take it as a chapter. It's very long for an introduction. First, I wanted to do kind of a state of the field overview, but I also didn't want to recycle the usual suspects, apart from Bazan, who's still very generative, right? I wanted to pay attention to lesser known works by notable scholars, right? But also I wanted to incorporate in my own canon artists, practitioners, other theories that I felt were not fully incorporated into the discussion and should be incorporated, right? Because I had in mind also the idea of writing it as a textbook, as something accessible for the average reader, also for students, right? And then the second chapter, which is now chapter 1, on the census, was very challenging, but I wanted to take on the challenge of dismantling more, I would say, Western-centric, but very cautious of the West label, right? Because I talk about Southern Europe, for instance, Eastern Europe, Asian examples, Australia, and so on, right? So let's say, for the sake of simplifying, Western oriented sensory hierarchies, right? And how those often delimit how we define cinema and also how we prioritize our own scholarship, right? So I wanted to incorporate a little bit of, I'm not an expert, but disability studies. I wanted to include race, gender, but not in a way that checks boxes, if that makes sense, in a genuine way that is more inclusive, that helps us actually reach new breakthroughs, not just to check specific boxes. Is a genuine gesture to be more inclusive without claiming to be comprehensive, right? Okay. And then the next chapter is one that I'm particularly attached to because it builds on my previous work on borders, right? So interactivity is, on the one hand, a mediator between different borders, whether it's the physical, the human and the technological, the non-human ecology, and so on, that is continued in the next chapter. and then to also talk about socio-political issues and certain interactive practices that actually were either consequent or they were responding to particular crises, historical, political, cultural crises, and crisis of meaning, right? So that chapter, beyond Kino Automat, is one of the central case studies, also covers cases from the Balkans, for instance, more contemporary examples that still deal with borders and new cartographies and the role of participation and so on. And then, of course, I also, in a different chapter, wanted to weigh in on current debates having to do with the digital humanities, with artificial intelligence, immersion, empathy, and so on. And I wanted to end, but really begin with a meditation on ethics, the ethics of spectatorship, and bring in controversial examples from not only cinema, but also performance art, because I feel like the critical kind of baggage is more apparatus agnostic, it goes beyond cinema. So yes, and then the conclusion is very short because I don't like it. It doesn't. I cannot conclude, but I would suggest to actually read the conclusion first for readers that are new to interactive cinema and for people that are wondering what is the value of this book. You know, it was pandemic inspired. What is the purpose of humanities scholarship in a seemingly collapsing world? So I wrote it with the pandemic in mind and crisis in mind.
If I could just, oh, I'm sorry, Bruno, if I could
No,
just
go ahead, Rebecca.
jump in for a second, because, you know, obviously your subtitle is The Ambiguous Ethics of Media Participation, and you know, started to touch on that in describing that penultimate chapter. But I was hoping you could just expand a little bit more on some of the ethical issues that these objects and experiences raise.
Yes, that's a good question. Very difficult, I would say. And that particular chapter was also very challenging in trying to articulate it, right? Because sometimes I feel like in scholarship, in public facing work, sometimes we tend to conflate ethics with politics or ethics with political agendas. So I wanted to consider them as both as together, but also as distinct, right? And I wanted to discuss the ethics of spectatorship and what that could mean. And it varies depending on case studies. That's why I think the case studies are very important in that chapter. I didn't want it to get too philosophical, because then it becomes abstract to the point of what are ethics, what is morality. So I picked deliberately controversial examples such as Stockholm and exploration of true love. I also went back to controversial performances, for instance, by Marina Abramovic, and so on. And then also going back to audience reception studies, Judith Main's work was particularly informative in terms of not trying to go for easy conclusions, not trying to neatly taxonomize how audiences respond to something or generalize, right? So I thought that extreme case studies really push the limits of what we consider to be ethical cinematic representation. How is visuality inevitably enmeshed in the ethics of the visual? And can we ever kind of separate the two, maybe through the different modalities that I proposed in the first chapter, right? And then I also looked at I looked to other fields. So for instance, the study of on-screen taboos and how audiences respond to them in a qualitative, quantitative, sociological ways. I went outside of my field to find things that were not inherently there for me. And also I wanted to go to other areas. I didn't want it to be a sanitized discussion, but hopefully this will be thought-provoking, because I also discuss some of the issues with the feminist label in specific practices, how sometimes that makes a practice immune from criticism for fear that it might undo a lot of, for instance, women's rights movements and so on, which I do not think it does, right? But I was thinking, what if, for instance, if we reconfigure the visual hierarchy, right? A hierarchy that starts with the visual, we reconfigure it and we consider tactility as a form of provocation, something that dismantles visual ethics and so on. Okay, that's an empowering alternative possibility. But what if sometimes tactility and the touch just becomes a material, it's hard to articulate now, a material execution of the gaze, which in that case can be even more dangerous, and it can enforce patriarchal norms instead of dismantle them. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was something I was struggling to articulate in that chapter on ethics and also in the chapter on sensory hierarchies, right? And to problematize a little bit, or to at least interrogate what makes a work feminist, right? What makes it empowering in terms of gender. So I had to speak in terms of myself, right? To gender myself, to mention my subjectivity, because I don't want my response to limit other possible responses, right? Or to undermine the potency of all of these works. Yes. I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
Yeah, it is complicated, but that
Yes.
was helpful. Thank you. Mhm.
No, I should say the ethics one is my favorite chapter. And I'm teaching a course on film and violence, and so I'm planning on using that with particular probably the example of Stockholm. So can you tell us a little bit about that text? Because I think it illustrates very well not just the ethics of spectatorship and tactility that you were speaking about, but also how it disrupts the idea of a passive, or perhaps challenges us to rethink how spectators are never just passive entities.
Yes. So Stockholm is, or I should say was, an interactive DVD that, according to the director Stanton Odermars, was supposed to be an interactive case study of the psychological Stockholm syndrome, right? So it was supposed to use interactivity to immerse the viewer or user into potential scenarios that create the bond known as the Stockholm syndrome, where victims become, let's say, unnaturally attached to their oppressors, right? And through interactive mechanisms and gaming, it's gamifying Stockholm syndrome in a way, right? The techniques are actually, even though the subject matter and the fact that it's turned into an interactive, playful narrative, let's say, is controversial, but the interactive techniques have actually been used in DVDs for psychology classes, for psychology students, and so on, in order to get students more familiarized with specific psychological conditions, pathologies, and so on, right? But because it was labeled as an interactive film, I think that's where the more controversy came in, because the viewer is asked to intervene and, in a sense, asked to manifest on screen the different sadomasochistic acts that, according to this simplistic, causality, lead to the creation of Stockholm syndrome, right? So essentially, what I thought was very troublesome, but also I could not look away and I could not interact. I wanted to see what happens next, right? And it goes beyond gender, although it has been labeled as an anti-feminist work, right? I was questioning whether to purchase it or not, which is also a choice, right? Before it was banned on Amazon and other vendors. But I thought, regardless of going beyond the specific kind of problems and the ethics of visual representation, there were other experiences that were happening. For instance, Janet Murray's theory regarding interactivity and identification, also Catherine Hale's work on electronic literature, ergodic works, right? In terms of certain conditioning aspects that happen when certain processes in film spectatorship are not only haptically interactive, but they become almost automated. and almost computational. Okay, in order to get to the next level of the Stockholm syndrome, I have to do this. That means I have to engage in something that is visually taboo. I have to gas this female victim, right? I have to do bad things to her, and so on. And at first, it was obviously very hard to separate the gaming mechanisms with the ethics of visual representation, which is part of the point of incorporating this particular case study, and also being transparent that I think because of my female gender, I could get away with writing this work, right? And I'm always honest when I teach this part of subject to my students, that transparency in this case has helped me publish something that could be deemed very controversial, very taboo, and so on. It could be critiqued as anti-feminist, but I was very careful with my approach so that it doesn't fall into that criticism. And
Right.
I think I succeeded, but based on what you say, Bruno. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. You've mentioned this a few times, which is the issue of access, right, with ephemeral media. And this is common in most media scholarship or media archaeology projects. But in this case, you have the ephemerality of the text itself and the ephemerality of the format, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that you have faced and also how you have overcome them or managed to replicate or try to closely replicate the conditions of reception of a piece that you were able to recover?
Yes, and I will say, so when I started studying interactive media, some of the challenges were not there yet. For instance, we could still freely access Flash-based, web-based works, right? What a luxury. Our laptops came with an embedded disk drive, so I could play CD-ROMs with no problem, and so on. And so I began just very simply taking screenshots, QuickTime videos, just for my own, just because with some of these works, you can spend hours or days exploring everything. So I was just charting my paths, things that I found to be interesting, and so on. And little did I know, or maybe subconsciously, I was aware of this ephemerality, of course, of the digital, right? That those would be some of the few remaining traces for some of this media, right? So initially, some challenges were not there yet, but looking back, for instance, floppy disks, laser disks. I used to work as a manager for media archives, so I already knew that older forms were prone to, let's say, if they were analog, to material degradation. If they were early digital, that doesn't mean they're immune to corruption, to disappearance, right? So I was looking at platform-specific, hardware-specific, other specific tools, right? And also from knowing the history of video art, for instance, the history of expanded cinema. There are so many ephemeral traces, right? Ephemeral projects. So yeah, I initially began with that blog that I mentioned, InterArchive, and just taking screenshots, some videos, and so on. And then when I started working at NYU almost a decade ago now, with the support of the Moving Image Archiving and Preservation Program and our initial technician, Ethan Gates, who wrote some great blog posts that you can find on how he emulated our initial interactive media collection. And then now we have our study center coordinator, Ina Kajulis, who has taught me valuable kind of lessons in DIY emulating, how to preserve my discs, and so on. So now I would say we operate with the assumption that original media will not be accessible, right? And in fact, this fall, I'm curating an exhibition, an interactive exhibition that will showcase some of the discs in our collection, some of the artists that are featured in the book and beyond, and so on. And I want to mention, so I am involved in a new exciting collaboration with Eric Lawyer, who, in case you're not familiar with Eric Lawyer, he's a creative technologist, interface designer, digital humanist before the term was a thing. And he was a person who adapted Anne Friedberg's The Virtual Window into an interactive version.
Mhm.
So appropriately, I always wanted to work with him because Anne Friedberg's work has been inspirational to my own work, as well as Eric Loyer's pioneering multimedia scholarship since the turn of the century. So Eric and I, with consultation with some of the artists featured in the book and also extra artists that I'm personally familiar with, we are working on a new project where we're going to play around with different ways of recontextualizing, of remediating disappearing media or media that are in danger of disappearing. And then we want to include the user into the experience. So we are thinking of it as a kind of archival remix where users will kind of come into this context from their own perspective, and they'll be able to access the different tracks, let's say the audio, the tactile aspects. We might try to do something with smell and taste. So we want to experiment in multimodal ways. And they can access different parts in discrete ways, and then they can put them together in different ways to create something new. And actually, so far, some of the artists that are donating kind of their work, they are also very curious to see the new iterations of their projects and how we put them together in new contexts. And eventually, I really, in terms of your question on initiatives, I want this to be a more expansive ecosystem, like a platform for artists to contribute their works, to revisit their works in their own way, to add to their works. I want students to do media archaeology projects using this platform. So it will be a form of preservation, some emulation eventually, but also remediation and remixing. It's still at a very experimental stage, but if anybody's interested, I'll send you the crowdfunding kind of links and so on, because I'm in the process of pitching it to different groups and organizations.
Thank you so much, Marina. We are at about our final 10 minutes, so I do want to make sure we have time to get to some questions that are starting to filter in. There's one here from Netta Alexander. Hi, Netta. Thank you for coming. Congratulations, Marina. I'm very much looking forward to reading and teaching this book. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the recent debates regarding AI-generated films and the algorithmic personalization of films. For example, enabling viewers to incorporate themselves into the film by an avatar. This has also been at the heart of the Hollywood strike as it opens up discussion of labor and automation. Not sure if this is something covered in the book, but would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Netta. Great question.
Yes. Hi, Neda. Thank you for your question. At this point, I will mention I have a separate project called expressiveai.net, which is dedicated to cinematic experiments with AI and historicizing experiments with AI and computational technologies. So it goes beyond the current hype and generative AI. I would say it's more prehistoric AI. So some of that is featured in the chapter on non or post-human interactivity, let's say. But because of the timeline of the book, I didn't have time to weigh in on the current concerns regarding labor, the Hollywood strike, and so on. And I think because now I'm slowly going to shift partially my focus to expressive AI, I think there's a lot of room in that kind of forum for those debates. In the book, I was particularly interested in early cinematic experiments with AI that focus more on co-creation rather than the binary of good versus evil, right? Which, of course, now is very necessary to discuss and sometimes necessary to think in that binary, right? Otherwise, the corporate sector will get away with a lot of ethically questionable practices, right? But in that chapter, I was trying to go beyond the alarmist and the maybe the technophobic aspects that, again, are necessary in this current landscape. and to look at the history of artificial intelligence, artificial life in a more ecological sense, and how that intersects with artists that were critically using that technology to bring attention to socio-political, ethical, ideological issues. For instance, Paul Van Oos's collaborative AI documentaries, Lynn Hirschman Leeson and Tony Duff's experiments with AI from the late 90s, early 2000s, and so on. So I went more with the historical aspect, I would say, in that sense, but that's definitely something, it's like a work in progress, but it was beyond the scope of the book at that point, unfortunately.
Any more questions? Well, while we're waiting to see if more questions come in, I would like to return to something, Marina, that you mentioned in just our sort of pre-webinar chat about how you've been finding the response to this book and this subject is different in Europe versus the sort of questions that you tend to field here in the US. And I thought that was very interesting. So could you tell a little bit about that?
Okay, yes. I don't want to overly generalize. This is just my impression from giving book talks in different parts of the world, and also research talks before the book was published. I did notice that particularly in specific parts of Europe, and also when I was in Brazil before COVID, the discussion and the Q&A was more oriented towards political, socio-political aspects. And in the US, again, not to stereotype, but more interest in the interactive parts, in the digital humanities parts, in other things. So, but I noticed in other contexts, particularly the chapter on borders, and also my interrogation and dismantling of the concept of democracy in different socio-political and historical contexts, and how that fluctuates, going back to its ancient Greek origins, supposed origins, let's say, and so on. And I noticed that certain audiences are more fixated on that. They want to hear more politicized criticism. And I think in the US, it's the other way around, because of cancel culture, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I heard a lot of provocative questions that I don't think would be asked honestly in a US forum, or the people would feel comfortable asking. So, but it made for interesting, and like every presentation is unique. So that's great.
Great. Well, we do have another question now. This is from Matthew Elfenbein. Thank you for this discussion. Congratulations on the book. Do you have any plans to do Kino Automat tours along with the book? Please bring it to our cities.
Well, I don't have the rights, right? We just happen to have the DVD, and now it's emulations, right? So that would be a much bigger discussion initiative. I would have to go back to Chris Hales and to Chinchera's surviving relative and see. I'm glad there is interest. And Matthew, you have been to quite a few Kino Automat screenings through Cinema Studies. But I will say in the fall, when we host our hands-on interactive cinema exhibition, there will be a public screening of Kino Automat. And that's a great icebreaker. It's a crowd pleaser. So I always love screening that film. I never get sick of it. It's so interesting, not just for the interactivity, but for the very disguised socio-political commentary, Cold War kind of hidden hints. And it's very entertaining, very humorous to watch, despite some of its now sexist aspects, I would say. Yes, it's a product of its time.
Great. A question here that I almost missed. It's in the chat from Dana Pollan. Congratulations. Know how brilliant the book is. Could you say a few words about audiovisual pedagogy in the present with so many crises confronting us, ecological, political, racial, etc.?
Oh, that's a big question. And Dana is my very supportive department chair. So he, it's Bob Stam, not Dana, it says in the...
I guess he's using the other Use
Oh,
he's in
okay.
hiding.
So
Oh yeah, because it comes up. I see it as Dana. So
okay. So it's my mentor, Bob Stam, who is also here. Yeah, so and Bob, I know you are particularly interested in pedagogy, and also in light of specific crisis, we often have to adapt our syllabi. Sometimes, as you know, we have to take things out
Mm.
because they are controversial, and bring things in because they're no longer controversial, and so on. So in terms of audiovisual pedagogy, I would say in on my end, I have published quite a few articles on pedagogy, which I think are very useful in terms of how to teach specific controversial topics in a way that doesn't impose, let's say, the professor's particular agenda or politics onto the students. It creates room for critical individual thought. Multiple viewpoints can coexist in a respectful manner, and so on. And it's a very broad question, right? But I will point you to another source because I'm actively working on it. It's called the weirdwavearchive.com. So it's the repository of the work that my students and I do in relation to a course that I teach called the Greek Weird Wave. And that course contains, besides a trigger warning, the scholarship in that course is probably the most thought-provoking, most out of the box, most political scholarship. So I would take a look at the essays that the students are writing with the intention in mind that it will be public-facing scholarship, right? I don't want anybody to get into trouble for their opinions. How to do that respectfully and in an open-ended format. Yes, so I think that that particular strand of scholarship related to crisis cinema, activist media, and what that could mean is very, very useful. And in the book, I don't go that far, but there are other aspects of my work and my pedagogy that are very much informed by manifestos, by political criticism, political economy, and so on.
well, thank you. We are just about out of time, so I will wrap things up just with a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and will be available through our filmquarterly.org website. So you can look for it there. In about a week's time, we should have that up and running. And just would like to say, a heartfelt thank you to you, Marina, for joining us all the way from Barcelona, and for writing this book that I think is going to be so valuable to scholarship in this area, and has a beautiful cover.
One more time.
Yeah. And many thanks to you, Bruno, for leading us through this discussion, as always. So we'll end there, and wish everyone a good remainder of the summer.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thanks, everybody.